Welcome to a special episode of American Rifleman Television. We're on location today in Lexington, Massachusetts. Today, this is a busy Boston suburb, but 250 years ago, Lexington was a quiet country town. And this is the site where 80 men under the command of Captain John Parker of the Lexington Militia confronted the advance column of British light infantry and grenadiers coming out of Boston to seize and destroy supplies in the nearby town of Concord, Massachusetts. This is the spot where the first shot of the American Revolution was fired.
One of the interesting takeaways I have as someone who enjoys studying battles is the fact that Lexington and Concord could have very easily ended up very different than the way we read about it today. Normally, during that period of time, and all the way up through our own Civil War, you have an engagement, a clash of arms, and then you have disengagement. Somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody's left in control of the battlefield. Here you kind of have a British steamroller.
So the town of Concord had been a storehouse at different periods through King Philip's War. And after the Provincial Congress forms, they start to assemble warlike stores, they call them. Not just guns, but provisions, bowls, spoons, cloth, medicines, medical kits, hatchets, shovels, 15,000 canteens. They're trying to build up stores for an army. And there's one man, Colonel James Barrett, who is basically in charge of that. And under him, there's another man named Captain Jonas Haywood. And together, they work with the Committee of Safety and the Committee of Supplies to keep track of all of these materials and where they are. And muskets were not stored in Concord. The muskets were stored in Worcester along with bayonets. But Concord was filled with the provisions, ammunition, musket shot, artillery, and so General Gage decides, with some pressure from England, that he's going to send an expedition to Concord and destroy all these stores.
This is the biggest expedition that's been formed yet. It's 700 men. And there's going to be a little bit of a surprise factor that Gage tries to implement. He says, well, I'm going to send the main body of men along this road in the day, but early on I'm going to send the flank companies, which are the light infantry companies and the grenadier companies of these regiments. I'm going to send them early on in the early morning hours of April 19, 1775. And this is not a secret. Gage is horrible at keeping this under wraps.
So early in the morning on April 19th, obviously Lexington already knows that the regulars are on their march to Concord. And so Captain Parker calls his company out. And they don't really know where the British are at the time. They're told to go home if they live close. If they didn't, they hung out in Buckman Tavern right there on the green. And they had to wait for the drum to roll and call them to form up. So at dawn, the British column arrives with light infantry in the vanguard. And there's roughly 80 or so men. It's not known exactly how many actually make it back to the green at that time. And the British light infantry deploy and see Captain Parker's company there, armed, and basically tell them to disperse. And after a little bit of time, Parker, I think, decides, he left a deposition which discusses what happens, but decides it's probably best that they. So they disperse, and at that time, a shot is fired. Nobody knows who fired it, whether it was one of Parker's men or if it was British regular. But at that point, the British erupted with a volley and charge, and there's 8 men killed and 10 wounded. It's a really bloody affair. The British hang around for a little bit. They form back up. They do 3 huzzas and march off towards Concord, leaving Captain Parker and the town of Lexington with a devastating mess.
When we think of the Battle of Lexington, it really wasn't a battle. It was just sort of a half-hearted, accidental skirmish. But it's when the fighting and the firing starts.
Lots of the guns that the Americans were carrying, both Lexington and Concord, were called long fowlers. And what these were, they're just like they sound. They were long guns that were intended for hunting purposes, sporting purposes. Most were American-made. They could be fired with shot. However, they could also be fired with buck and ball and with regular ball, using paper cartridges. Hence, they certainly served their purpose at the beginning of the war and for a period throughout the war.
Well, the British were armed basically on April 19th with two kinds of guns. The long land musket, which is what the battalion troops and the grenadiers would have had, and the light infantry would have had the short land pattern muskets. The long land musket is a little bit heavier and it has a 46-inch barrel, whereas the short land has a 42-inch barrel and is a little bit lighter. It's a little easier to handle, and that was going to be the main gun of the British Army. But at this time, they're gradually doing a switch over that everybody would have the short land muskets, but it was far from complete.
After the events at Lexington, the British fired a celebratory volley on the green after they had all become reorganized, and then they continue their march to Concord.
There are two main entrances to the town, the north and the south bridges. The British want to deploy and cover those bridges. So as the main British column comes into town, the militia and the minute companies are moving out of town across the North Bridge. The British send light infantry companies to the North Bridge, and they send a grenadier company and two light infantry companies to the South Bridge to hold those bridges to keep anybody from coming back in. So the provincial minute militia companies head to a place called Punkatasset Hill in Concord. But then they move closer, and they move down to a place we call today the muster field. And it's just above the North Bridge. They can see the British below. And at that point, men from Acton arrive, some guys from Westford arrive. So you end up with around 450 men on this muster field. Now down below are three companies of light infantry, roughly around 100 men. And the men at the North Bridge or on the muster field are under the command of Major John Buttrick from Concord. His house is within eyeshot of where they are. And Colonel Barrett rides up. Colonel Barrett was the one who was in charge of the supplies, and he was a colonel of the militia regiment from the Concord area. And he tells them to not fire, basically, unless the British fire first. So they load up their guns, but one of the interesting things that was found in the 1930s were a bunch of musket flints found in two rows, about 100 flints. A field had been plowed for the first time. And a avocational archaeologist named Benjamin Lincoln Smith, a relative of Major General Benjamin Lincoln, was out there, and it had rained after the plow, and he said there were things standing out like glittering jewels. And he went down and he thought they were Native American artifacts, which is what he was looking for. And he ended up collecting these 100 gun flints. And he realized what they were. There were two rows basically facing the North Bridge. So they must have been ordered to change their flints to make sure that their guns went off when they marched down to the bridge.
Behind me is a replica of the Concord North Bridge. This is the site of one of the most fateful moments in American history. On April 19th, 1775, 250 years ago, that bridge was being guarded by a detachment of British light infantry, while the main British force in the town of Concord burned and destroyed the supplies that they were sent out of Boston to find. It was here that the engagement really started, when a shot was fired by that light infantry toward the body of militiamen, who then responded. This is really where Ralph Waldo Emerson was talking about when he wrote the fateful words, "The shot heard round the world."